What is art history? The earliest artworks were created almost 40,000 years ago. Our connection to these works carries a certain distance. Is it simply because some of these works were made so long ago? Or is it because there was little to no recorded history during much of that time to offer us the in-depth context that we now have for newer works in the contemporary world? But even without a context, we can wonder and marvel at medium, material, and even subject matter that artists choose. Throughout history, even histories that we have little to no knowledge of, circumstances leading up to the creation of the artworks in those times, we can still find beauty and marvel at the artworks created. The unique visual perspective or size of a piece can capture our attention. These reactions would fall under the term aesthetics. Aesthetics is a philosophical term that explores the nature of beauty in our lives and also covers our relationship to intentional visual artworks. Though common in our lifetime, artworks display in commercial galleries and in institutional museums are relatively a newer way to experience art. Throughout history, artists created specific pieces for specific settings. When we break down the words art and history, we can understand art as the experience of the presence of an object in front of us, and the history is the recorded and interpretation of past events. The aim of art history, then, is to better decipher the circumstances that give rise to the construction of a building or artwork. Let me rephrase that. What circumstances gave rise to the construction of a building or artwork? This means the study and source of history is vital to practicing art history. Artists' choices and persistence of an individual approach can also be said to influencing culture at large, and thus playing a role in how history is remembered. This lecture will explore some of these subjects and questions that art historians ask. If I go back a slide, and we go back to thinking about art in the museum, I want to just talk a little bit more about the nature of that, and again, how modern or current that experience actually is. So again, a lot of us have experienced going to a museum before, maybe even just going to a commercial gallery before, and seeing artworks hung on a wall. Sometimes these artworks are arranged in a specific curation, a show that has a specific goal in mind, or an aesthetic. However, in a museum, oftentimes they're hung in a chronological way. This is so that museum visitors can understand the artwork with a certain historical context. What is the experience of the audience then is not just for the appreciation of the artwork itself, but depending on, again, the museum or the gallery, you're starting to understand a certain message overall, or connection between the artworks, sometimes even the lack of connection between certain artworks. The subject of individual works can be sometimes the focus, and again, sometimes more less in focus because of the combination of artworks displayed. In some circumstances, viewers can directly react to what they're seeing and interpret the work in light of their own experience. In other ways, or in other circumstances, artworks can be enjoyed as relatively something to just visit or see entertainment in. But again, this latter is more of a recent phenomenon, which also begs the question of then how this artwork, or what was the original intention of making this artwork? Was it to create that entertainment? Was it to satisfy specific people? Was it to specifically be grouped? Were artworks supposed to be seen together? These are all questions we might have when going through a museum, or again, even going through a more contemporary gallery. The range of objects art historians consider are architecture, sculpture, the pictorial arts, painting, drawing, printmaking, and photography, the craft arts, as well as the arts of design. Even if objects were created for utilitarian purposes, art historians glean a lot from studying the craftsmanship, materials, and subject of many works in that they may not have been classified as art originally. Craft arts. The craft arts can include the word design often and refer from anything as far as very utilitarian things like ceramics or metalwork, things that we might ascribe to jewelry or just more fashion-based pieces. But they can also be pieces that are just in relation to our ordinary living. In other words, one sofa or chair that in one time period might seem very common in every single household or commonly seen in industries or industrial situations or institutional situations. Those same things can become more rare as time moves on and be held as a signature of the time. When we look more at artists themselves and their relation to the artwork and some of the artwork we might see in some of these museums, we have to, of course, think about subject. And also making, how they're made. When we look at this marble statue, are we assuming that this artist chose marble out of a hat? Are we assuming that this marble was something easy to find or easy to cultivate and work out of? Oftentimes, when we're looking at anything older than the 20th century, especially with sculpture, we're looking at artworks that were created from a patron, someone who was paying to have that artwork made. They were then also probably providing those same materials for the artist to make. Today's art historians study a multitude of objects, like we just talked about, and their creators and the owners. When I say owners, I mean, again, the patrons who are paying for that art. And that is all a part of the kind of surrounding art history. So it's not just the art itself, sometimes not just the artists themselves, but it's all facets and all roles. When we look at the role of the artist, contemporary artists, this is one example of a painter that lives in, lived the latter part of their life in New Windsor, Maryland. Clyfford Still created a series of paintings, what we would call as abstract art, all based on using pure color. So not a lot of mixed color in the paints, in the application of the paint. And the paintings themselves were typically title just with the year of their creation. This is an interesting artist to talk about when just thinking about studio practice artists. So Clyfford Still, born in 1904, at the very beginning of the 20th century, maybe just 20 so years before, artists started to take on this role of having their own studios, having their own practice and picking their subject matter, and not waiting around for patrons or working in a workshop of other artists to advance their career. So again, in a relative term, though it's 120 years ago, the 20th century kind of marks when artists started to take on their own individuality a lot more. However, that said, just because someone was buying their artwork doesn't, of course, mean a vision or a style couldn't come into the artwork, couldn't come into play in the execution of those artworks. So again, throughout history, most artists created artworks for these patrons and settings to fulfill a specific purpose, even if no one knew the original context of some of those artworks or even subjects. Art appreciation does not require the knowledge of the historical context of an artwork. However, art history does. So, as art historians, when we're looking at artworks, we start to question and ask for research towards decisions that the artist made, what they used for materials, when they happened to make their artwork, perhaps what was going on in the specific regional context they made their artwork. If we look at this painting by Mark Rothko, made in 1950, you'll notice the title is called White Center. When we look at it, what elements might we use to describe this painting? What do you think was the intention of this artwork? Here is a little bit of a writing I'd like you to just read for a moment about the description, I should say, about this piece. A description of how it was made and the structure and order that Mark Rothko used the materials. After we think a little bit more about that, I'd like you to come up with some of your answers for yourself. So without all of the context of knowing the piece, without doing our own research here, what are we left with just formally in the qualities of the artwork that we see? What about the size of the artwork did you notice? What about the shape or shapes included in the artwork? Color seems very important. We notice that even in the title. How does color and the use of color matter here? Do we have any hints or examples of texture? What about the material? Is there one material used, or are there multiple materials used in this piece? Strictly, even though it's an abstract piece, strictly from a formal perspective, what's the composition that we're looking at here? Is there an order to how things are composed. The last slide told you a little bit about the technique. Is there anything about just looking at the artwork that hints at or suggests part of the artist's technique? What's the perspective, or even perhaps foreshortening that could be seen here? Or maybe there's none at all. I ask you to maybe do a little bit more research past this slideshow here. On this painting, you've got the title, you've got the artist's name, and see if there's anything more that you can come up with about any of the elements here in this piece. When introducing and thinking about the kind of core of art history, we have to start to go over how and what are some of the questions that art historians ask. We've gone over some of them already when just looking at that last piece as far as strictly just elements of the artwork. However, if we break down some subjects, we have different categories of visuals. So one could be religious, mythological, historical, genre, portraiture, landscape, still life, and then infinite combinations and subcategories of all of these. The first question we might ask is, how old is it? The physical evidence is often a strong indication here. Certain materials were not invented until specific dates, and thus the question of material can be an initial clue here. If wood is used on a sculpture or a building, sometimes tree rings are present and can give us a clue to age. Documentary evidence. Written documents and official records can help pinpoint the date of a piece. This comes up especially if an artwork was commissioned to be made and a financial contract was created. Internal evidence. An identifiable person or fashion, hairstyle that's sometimes included in the subject of the piece can identify or at least give us a rough idea of when something was made. Stylistic evidence. An artist's distinctive style can also help pinpoint when a work was created, as it refers to other works in an artist's catalog. What is the style? Well, defining style is one of the key elements of art historical inquiry. Although the analysis solely in terms of style is no longer as prevalent as it used to be in the field, it still provides an important way to categorize. We can think of period style, the manner of a specific era, usually within a certain culture. We can think of regional style, the way to study style based on geography. Personal style, of course, the distinctive manner of individual artists. When we think about personal style, we look at two different works here. One on the left, Georgia O'Keeffe, and one on the right, from Ben Shahn. In Georgia O'Keeffe's piece, we see style come through a little bit simply in the cropping of the composition. As she paints a flower, she zooms in, gets in real close to the center of the flower, showing us enough detail at the edges, especially towards the top, to reveal or at least hint at what her subject is. And yet she opens up a new way of looking at the flower, so many interpretations can follow. Another use of style, even though both of these pieces were created within a few years of each other, is very different. In Ben Shahn's piece, he almost uses what could be called as a kind of political statement, or at least a statement of the time that he was living in. So in this piece, he took a news story from Italy about some corruption between a couple of different judges and characterize these people, both the people who suffered from the tragedy, were wrongly accused and then were executed, the two people we see in the coffins there, and then the three people standing above them being the people who benefited from accusing them, again, wrongfully. The person that we see far in the distance, inside the window that kind of sits back from everyone, was the actual judge who made the decision. So by specifically kind of outing each person and characterizing them, not necessarily crudely, but just drawing them in such a way that we know that they're being not necessarily very realistically depicted, but depicted in almost, again, like a caricature style, Ben Shahn is specifically taking a stance on kind of retelling this story. Another thing we can think about where we kind of go off of style is, or I should say another question we could ask is, what is its subject? What is a piece's subject? Subject matter is the answer to the who or what in a piece. This can be as literal as the place, people, or details depicted. Like, for instance, in the Ben Shahn piece, all 6 of the people included in that picture can give us the who. But it can also be, more general, like going back to the Rothko, using the colors, textures, composition, and even size sometimes can be a more general way of looking at the subject. When details such as specific narratives, locations, and people are included, it is important to identify these and research the story behind them, or what they are even, to better understand the artist's inclusion. Art historians will often categorize images into religious, historical, mythological, genre, portraiture, landscape, still life, and all the subdivisions, like I mentioned before. One that comes into a few of these is iconography. Which is literally the writing of images referring back to content or the subject of an artwork and the study of that content in art. By extension, it also includes the study of symbols. Images that stand for other images or encapsulate ideas. A symbol can also be a familiar object that an artist has imbued with greater meaning. In this slide, we see a piece that's called The Last Judgment. This is only a detail from, it's quite a massive scale piece. When we look at just this detail, and towards the middle, you can see what almost looks like 2 baskets hanging. Those are scales, right? 2 balancing scales. In this case, just from the name alone, without even doing much research, we can tell Judgment Day and seeing scales. Scales could represent easily the scales of justice, or potentially even, if you look at kind of the creatures and the faces of those holding or right by the scales, you can tell one on the left seems much more human and one on the right that seems much more almost a creature-like. That could then refer to the idea of souls being more abstract and weighing in one way, or souls being much more human-based, like what we might refer to as empathetic to each other, right? So the idea there's many ideas of how we could read the symbols here, but by just literally having weighted balances, we have a very clear sense of symbol. There's some sort of symbol that those weights are supposed to represent. Another specific example is in Christian art. Each of the authors of the Bible, in the biblical gospel books, I should say, include the 4 evangelists and have a different attribute for each one. People can recognize St. Matthew by the winged man, John by his eagle, Mark by his lion, and Luke by his ox. Throughout the history of art, artists have used personifications. So abstract ideas codified in human form, sometimes taking the form of an animal or, again, a specific symbol. Another question art historians ask are, who made it? Attribution, signing, and detailing work, of course, is the most sure way of attribution. However, personal style also plays a big part. An anonymous ancient Greek artist, known as the Achilles painter that you're looking at right now, has such distinctive way of drawing an eye in profile that art historians were able to and have been able to attribute multiple works to this artist. Sometimes a group of artists are known to work similarly in a specific time and place. Art historians designate such a group as a school. For instance, the Dutch school of the 17th century. Another question that's important for art historians is, who paid for it? As I mentioned earlier, in a lot of art history, throughout a lot of art history, the idea of the patron is paramount to the artist. So, though personal style can be a romantic way of looking back at art history, often artists had little or only a little bit really to say on their subject or even their style. For most of art history, artists work from patrons who paid them to make a work or ongoing series of works to suit the patron's entertainment or political needs. For instance, when we look at this work of Augustus of Prima Porta, this is only obviously a smaller detail, again, of a freestanding, full-figured sculpture. Augustus, who lived to the age of 76 years old, which at that time was quite old, looks so young in all of his portraits and in each of the sculptures because he wished to be viewed as young and godlike. In his role as head of state throughout his reign, he wanted this kind of appearance, so to keep people in line and also to keep people to respect him and see him as almost immortal. In the art of portraiture, this is kind of a common tale as old as time. Folks pay for people to render them, but they also say, render me in this way. As a result, sometimes the patron reveals more information about the piece than the artist themselves. Now, let's transition a little bit to talk about some of the words art historians use. We'll be using these throughout the term. Let's start with form and composition. Really, this is the how question in art making. There are many types of formats of compositions that artists use. Of course, composition, how the artist composes or organizes the forms in an artwork by placing shapes on a flat surface if it's two-dimensional, or by arranging forms in space if it's sculptural or architectural. When we look at these two pieces back and forth, side by side here, they're created in very different times, one in 1864 and one in 1984. And yet, we can see some compositional similarities. Can you name three? When we go to kind of think of, there are some general compositional types. For anyone who's taken a studio class or will, these are all kind of oftentimes brought up early on as a guide to help you kind of organize your visual ideas, right? So just really quickly, we have down there on the right a rule of thirds, the idea of breaking up, especially if it's vertically oriented, a composition into a grid so that we've got three main sections. This helps us organize things from right to left and also know when things are either right in the center or if we want to move them away from that center. Number two, using triangles, right? Triangles two sides of a triangle are always going to be an arrow. So that's always going to point our view or kind of direct our view to one side of the piece or another. Number 3, we get the L shape. Whenever you use an L shape, you are also orienting us to one side or another, depending on which side the L is on. It can also be used to create kind of a claustrophobic environment, making almost the walls close in on the subject. Number 4, the S shape. The S shape can, as depicted here, can represent and kind of describe space in an interesting perspective as it descends, as it goes back. It can, again, also create some sort of diagonal, which we'll get to in a second, where we flow from one side of the composition down to the other. Number 5 there, the O shape. Now, our eyes are oval, so therefore our eyes always are going to be attracted to and want to go right away to anything rounded edged. So be it a perfect circle or any kind of other oval shape. Our eyes, when we see that in a composition, are always going to be very attracted to going there. And finally, a diagonal. Now again, just like the S shape, when you can go across space and go exactly from one side of a composition to another that goes kind of across it and through the middle, you are creating new planes of space. So diagonals can be really helpful, especially in more minimal works, to describe and suggest spatial breaks. Now, if we talk a little bit more about material and technique are going to be what artists use and how they use them for their chosen or found materials. Line. This is maybe the most essential, elemental component in art. So it's almost impossible to find a piece, be it again a piece of furniture to a piece of architecture or a specific example of architecture or any painting or, of course, any sculpture, to be without line. Sometimes this line is implied, but sometimes it's more about the proximity of the lines. For instance, if we look at the dots and scumbling in the bottom right, or even what's just to the left of it there too, the radiating lines, it's not just the lines themselves, but it's how close they are to each other, right? Right above the radiating one is, we've got thick and thin, right? So if a thicker line is by a thinner line, that again creates an illusion of space, but it's also how close are those lines together. That will make a big difference in their effect. So line being super elemental, but it being in kind of every piece of art, that's important to think about. The real question with line is, what is line doing in this piece? Next, we move to color. The most important thing to talk about when we're introducing color is, of course, that light reveals colors. So you can manipulate how important color is by how much light we, of course, show or use. When we're talking about light in the world, and when we're talking about additive color that is being used by artists, versus the artist, additive color being the color of light that comes together from the sky, right? And then also the light that's made from artists be using, of course, typically paint is the way we specifically think about that, but even markers or colored pencils, anything that is going to create color, that we call subtractive color. So additive color, where all the colors are added together and we get white, that's because it's coming from light. Subtractive color is made from material, right? So when we put it all together, usually we end up with some sort of mushy dark brown rather. Here is a color wheel, right? So this is looking at the subtractive color. So seeing it all together, we can see that what's known as the complementary colors are an opposite from each other. The orange across from the blue, the yellow across from the purple, the green across from the red. The primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, are going to be in that triangle there. That's why they're connected by that triangle, those three lines. In between them, we can start to understand the value shifts, right? Using color. So the blue the purple can kind of connect and get darker towards the blue. The blue can get kind of using aqua can get towards the green. The green using a kind of limer color can get towards the yellow. The yellow can, using some mustardy color, can get towards orange. Orange can, with a deeper red or orange, can get to red. And again, because red and blue together make purple, the redder side, so the more violet side of purple, is in between the red and the purple. So this color wheel, again, very elemental, but it can help, especially when breaking down pieces where color is paramount. Thinking again back to that Rothko piece. And just to kind of another way to specify this idea of additive versus subtractive color, when we think of the additive model, again, we're going to think of, even though we're initially talking about light from the sun, when we create light bulbs, we're still using that additive color. So for things like computer displays, monitors, any kind of projector monitor, we're always going to be thinking in the red, green, blue, and those all added together would give us white. Versus when we're printing material, we're thinking in the subtractive color model, because ink would be like paint in that way. So in this way, we have cyan, which is close to blue, magenta, and that way kind of stands in for the red and the blue together. And then, of course, yellow. And adding those all together gives us a black. So that gives you a different kind of balance of how you're looking at color when you're looking at it on a screen versus when you might see something that's printed out, which explains why sometimes things print out differently than they look on a screen. Another word that art historians would use would be texture, the quality of the surface of an object. Texture can determine character. Sometimes the texture is designed to be representational, and sometimes the texture appears due to age or poor upkeep of an artwork. Lack of preservation of a material can sometimes relate to texture. Sometimes artists lean into this. If we look at this Anselm Kiefer piece, Anselm Kiefer here is using three-dimensional objects on top of a painting. These objects, depending on how he used resin on top of them, will age in a different way than the paint itself. So this will create, over time, a different way that the textures will look. The the objects might kind of chip away, whereas the paint will last for a longer amount of time. Another term art historians use, space, mass, volume. Space is the bounded or boundless container of objects. For art historians, this can be the actual dimensional space of an object or architectural design space, or the illusionistic space created by the optical manipulation of a material. So when we talk about each one, mass and volume, we're usually talking much more about three-dimensional works. Volume, of course, is the space within an object or the space within an enclosure. Okay, space in general is going to be refer to any of something that is three-dimensional or two-dimensional. Of course, the crafts and art objects fall into that three-dimensional category as well. Another term, perspective and foreshortening. Perspective, using the space intentionally, brings us is a way to describe perspective. When the artist does that, when the artist uses it intentionally, when there is an organization of space to an image, in general, a straightforward example of this is, of course, foreshortening in of itself, right? When we look at a piece here, we're going to see Claude Lorraine's painting here. We're going to notice that as we move back in space towards the kind of sun setting there, everything's a lot less in focus. Not only that, the buildings we see are a lot smaller than the buildings we see on the left side of the piece that are up close to us, right? We're seeing a lot more detail and we're seeing them larger. That's a straightforward example of that perspective. That is a straightforward example of linear perspective, that we're understanding space as we see it from one point of view, from one head, right? We're not putting together a bunch of different viewpoints here. This is coming from two eyes, one place we're standing, and then we're looking at something beyond us. Perspective, though, in general, can be used not just to describe what we just talked of linear perspective. It can also be used to describe something that's a little bit more emotive. So in Ogata Koren's piece here, we notice that if you look down at the waves, they're very, very similar to the way the clouds are painted in the sky. It takes a minute to realize they're even different, right? As we look up and we kind of see that gold in the sky sit back, more in the linear perspective model, but it's interrupted by this kind of fluid ocean waves to cloud in high up. This is creating a much more psychological, right, point of view. It's giving that sense of if you're looking and perhaps you're looking in one place, your eyes might start to drift, or you might even kind of blur out what you're not looking at, and everything kind of flows together. Or if you're staring into space, maybe just in your own thoughts, something like this is almost like representative of that experience. So this would still be perspective. The goal here isn't, this artist did not, it's not that they didn't understand that the clouds in the skies wouldn't be painted the same way, but, the clouds and the waves wouldn't be painted the same way. However, it's this idea of creating a new effect. So even though this piece was created in the Edo period a long, long time ago, it's not something that's kind of seen as abstract art. It is simply representing a different kind of perspective than we have in this linear perspective piece. Okay? When we go back here, what I just referred to, linear perspective, can also be referred to starting with 1-point perspective, which as we go into more examples, we will look at 1-point, 2-point, and sometimes, probably not in this class as much, but 3-point perspective comes in later on in our history. This just includes having a foreground, middle ground, and background. Foreshortening specifically, as I brought up earlier, is of course going to be that size, right? That idea of size being everything's bigger as it's closer to us, in more detail as it's closer to us, and things get smaller as they fall back. This can be used in exaggerated ways, as you can see in this drawing here, right? Where we've got the hand is so close to our eyes or our viewpoint, and so the finger looks like it's about to poke us, versus the figure, the subject's other hand, which is out of frame, but the arm, where the wrist is, right where our hand would begin, is so much smaller in comparison to the hand that's in our face. So this gives us this kind of idea of spatial illusion here, because of course everything was drawn in the same plane of space, and yet we believe that that one arm is way farther back, some feet back from the other hand that's in our face. Next, we have proportion and scale. Proportion concerns the relationships of the parts of the persons, buildings, or objects. This can be done through style, intuition, or even straightforward mathematics. Proportional systems can differ from period to period in art history. So just as a really simple example here, we have, of course, the Statue of Liberty, which as you can see is almost the same size as a really, really tall tree. Now, no human, of course, nears that size, but that emphasizes, again, something. It tells us something about why that sculpture was made at that size. What were they trying to emphasize? What is Lady Liberty supposed to stand for? If it was smaller, how would it differ? If it was even bigger, how would it differ? So gives us some sort of idea. Also, another thing to consider is where they placed the Statue of Liberty. As many of you know, it's placed at the edge and kind of some people see it directly, of course, from the water or from a very far distance. Not everyone is seeing it really up close, which means if it's really large and we're seeing it quite small, we see it in the same context as being similar to or in context to a large city. So how does that change our perspective? Knowing that we were going to see it from far away, that gives us, it kind of changes the proportion or scale of in this case, the sculpture to the buildings around it. Next, I'm just going to break down a few terms that have to do with sculpture, because as we're going to be looking at with sculptures, there can be both what we call additive, just like light. When we talk about additive and subtractive light, there can be an additive sculpture or there can be a subtractive sculpture. So what I mean with additive sculpture is when an artist starts with the material and they start either putting them together, what we call assemblage. In this piece here, we see all these kind of pieces put on top of each other and put inside of, right? So these things were either glued down or adhered or balancing on each other. This is all additive because you're putting things that were made separately together. The subtractive sculpture is when you have one big piece of something and you start chipping away at it or carving it or changing it to make your sculpture. So in this case, the marble, right? By Michelangelo carving away at this marble, creating both a person, but also a figurative, I should say, element, but also leaving some of that marble just looking much more organically. In that case, since it was unfinished, but just seeing that, since we have the reference to see it now in this state, we can see what it was chipped away from. So that would be called subtractive sculpture. Lastly, we'll look at, these sculpture terms, we'll look at what's called relief sculpture. So the last two examples we were talking about with sculptures were something that were freestanding, right? That you could walk all the way around them and look at them. But if sculptures rely on an architectural framework or setting, if they have to kind of be up against something, they need something to hang or connect to, they're going to be called relief sculptures. So the subjects in relief sculptures project from the background, as you can see in all the three examples here. But there are three different types of what we call relief sculpture. There's kind of three, it's almost like a sliding scale, okay? So if the subjects are projecting from the background at a very boldly, coming out really a lot, we're going to say that that is high relief, okay? In low relief, which you can see at the top with those two what look like coins there, and just like on the coins you have seen in our, just coins we have around in the U.S., they're going to have a low relief, right? They're going to be slightly projecting off the surface, but only a little bit. So there's a little bit of sense of shadow nearby that they're projecting off the surface, but very little. Whereas in a piece to the right, the Robert Longo piece, you can see all these deep shadows that are setting in because of how far the legs are coming off. And in a middle relief piece, perhaps that piece in the bottom left there, we can see where something is starting to project a little bit more, so it's getting those shadows, but maybe not creating as high a projection of pieces coming off. Here's another example. I wanted to give you guys a more modern example too of relief. So in the last, let's say 100 years or so, maybe even a little less, in the last like 80 years or so, sculptors or artists have created pieces that come off the wall, but then also acknowledge the wall, and they've been a lot more material based, right? So instead of trying to depict like the last ones were, they were depicting a specific subject. Here, the subject is, and again, just like that Rothko piece, is the material itself. So in this case, the material is coming off and connecting to two walls, right? So it's still a relief sculpture. It's still using objects and materials to connect with an architectural framework, but it's still projecting. But it's not doing it in a way that's depicting a specific pictorial subject. That said, looking at this, would you consider this piece high relief, low relief, or is it middle relief? I'll leave you with that. Lastly, this is our last slide. It's just an important thing to go kind of leave you with is cultural context is very important in the study of art history. As I've mentioned a few different ways already in this lecture, sometimes doing some extra research about the time or region in the specific, about a specific work is really important. In Kawashi's 11th century painting here, we can understand the perspective in the piece better than we can understand the perspective in the piece better once we research a little bit about the time. Okay, so if we see this and we just talk about this piece in connection with, let's say, a painting someone made 2 years ago from right now, it's going to look a lot, or it's going to be a lot of a different communication or different conversation. But seeing it, knowing it was made back in the 11th century, and you put that up against in relation to other works that were made in the 11th century in other places of the world. So this is Chinese, but in other parts of the world, what was happening there? That might be an interesting place to start to kind of put it in relation. But I can specifically tell you that Chinese art historians have a word called spirit resonance. And this was a word that they found to relate to, it kind of passed down from as different people talked about paintings. If you look at the top right, you'll see some text. And then also on the very bottom, right and left, you'll see some of that red stamps. You'll see also some text. That isn't just the artist's signature. So the text at the top right is a poem that wasn't originally on the painting. The patron of this painting, passed down through family to family, eventually, centuries later, wrote the poem after being inspired by the piece. Now, this all comes back to spirit resonance. What does that mean? So spirit resonance in art history, again, Chinese or historians break that term down to mean the kind of overwhelming nature of a perspective in an artwork. Okay, I know earlier we talked about in the Japanese artwork, we talked about how the sky, the clouds, and the ocean were connecting and were similar. This is kind of close to that, but again, it's a different culture and it's a little bit of a different idea in that in this piece, I know it's quite intricate and so therefore it seems a little bit small in this view. But if you realize that we can look down, we look like we're on a high, we're standing high and able to look down at the rocks below. But then when you look up at the piece, you also look like you're looking at something above you. So unlike the linear perspective piece of the Lorraine painting we saw, in this piece, we're looking both up and down at the same time. So we're getting kind of multiple perspectives, which if you do this for long enough, will create somewhat of a vertigo. It'll create somewhat of a confusion or almost instability in us looking at it, right? This kind of instability is, again, intended. It's intended to say when you're in nature, when you're in beautiful mountain landscapes, you will be in awe of what you're looking at. You will not be able to see it you will not keep your head still and look at it from one point of view, like oftentimes the Renaissance, post-Renaissance artwork was in Europe says. You will not have a mathematical approach to looking. You will not keep your head straight, but instead you'll move your head up, then you move your head down because, again, you're so in awe of what you're looking at. So this is just one example of how culture and understanding a little bit more about the culture can tell us why. Why did this artist have us look down and up? Is that a mistake? Is that intentional? Well, knowing a little bit more about the culture and also specifically the art history in that culture can tell us this. So sometimes this requires extra research. Sometimes this will be in our textbook, but sometimes this might be something that you will have to do a little extra research to figure out. Thanks very much.